Now, in living out the Beatitudes, there's a little bit of a subtext for at least in law enforcement, but I do think it applies for all of us. There's an element of the theology of the cross. There's a need to understand that at our best, we're sinner saints. There's even an element of what I would call a theology of suffering related to theodicy, the problem of evil. Why does God let good people suffer? All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's a real personal issue for me, dealing with law enforcement. For those that don't know me, some of you may have seen on the brochure talking about the different topics covered that all right, so for those that don't know me, my name is Pastor Lou Florio. I serve at Christ Lutheran in Fredericksburg as the associate pastor. I'm a former police officer, served 6 years in the city of Alexandria, Virginia. I am a police chaplain. I've worked with police chaplaincy since 2008. I still assist in Hanover County, mostly for training, and then the city of Fredericksburg, I'm the primary and only chaplain that they have. For those that are interested, you might want to check out a blog and podcast I have. It's called Midnight's LEO. It's spelled like Leo, but it stands for Law Enforcement Officer. It's basically a wellness for police, kind of spiritual and other wellness issues are addressed in there. I have a lot of experience dealing with trauma and secondary trauma, particularly over these last few years. There's been a lot more calls for service related to that. And so if there's anything in the future that your congregation has or wants to see how maybe they can assist first responders regarding these issues, let me know and I will try to help if I can. Another thing I wanted to mention is, this is a pretty serious topic. If for any reason you feel a little bit overwhelmed, I'm trying to make sure we don't get into too much stuff. But if there's any reason you need to step away, please feel free to do so. I'm not going to be offended in any way. You have to take care of yourself. As we begin, I'm going to ask you to join me in prayer. This is a prayer from Brother Roger of Taizé, who was a really major influence on me and really impacted how I looked at my policing back in the day. O God, Father of every human being, you ask us to bring love where the poor are humiliated, reconciliation where human beings are divided, joy where the church is shaken. You open the road to us that we may be ferments of communion throughout the entire human family. Amen. All right, so police as peacemakers. It's a difficult topic. It's a hot button topic. I can look at just the news from the last week. Of course, information about Memphis has come out. There's in Virginia, Charles City, you may have seen that a police officer shot another police officer after a night out. I'm sure there's a lot of background to that story. And then in New York State, some probation police were doing some kind of investigation and stole thousands of dollars from somebody. With all these things going on, I totally recognize that there's a lot of well-adjusted, dedicated, heart-centered, faithful police officers out there. Tonight, we're going to be talking about some of the underbelly issues as well. It's a hot button issue and it's very complicated with many, many layers. But I think it's important for us to talk about some of these moral dichotomies that exist so that we can better embrace them and engage them and maybe even find some solutions to move forward. I also recognize that a lot of times a person's opinion about policing is very personal. You could have one bad interaction on a traffic stop with an officer and that can just shadow your opinion of all police. You can also have some good interactions, as I did growing up as a kid, and that probably helped me decide to be a police officer because of that positive relationship I had. So it can be very, very personal and different for everyone. In this discussion, I'm just going to try to talk a little bit about some of the things from a policing experiential direction. But the point being is that we're going to try to move towards applying it to our own lives as we go forward. What can we learn from their extreme experiences? Okay, and so hopefully we'll have some time for conversation later. Now, in living out the Beatitudes, there's a little bit of a subtext for at least in law enforcement, but I do think it applies for all of us. There's an element of the theology of the cross. There's a need to understand that at our best, we're sinner saints. There's even an element of what I would call a theology of suffering related to theodicy, the problem of evil. Why does God let good people suffer, things like that? And wrapped up all in it is just even last week or 2 weeks ago, an officer unsolicited talking about some wellness issues with him in a meeting I was at. He said, people don't seem to understand that we're only human. And so we're going to try to embrace that human aspect of being a peacemaker. We're called to something very high, but we're human. Another thing that I'd like to suggest for you to remember is that police officers are lied to just about every single day. They're also insulted about every single day. They can be hated by someone they've never met before. They can have their life threatened quite regularly. They see a disproportionate amount of evil and a lot of grotesque death. So part of the challenge is how do people stay resilient and positive in the face of such things. That's kind of where a chaplain comes in, trying to help with that. And this affects families too. In 2020, when the protests were starting, there was some violence going on, and on social media, a lot of people were so shocked about everything, they could be very blunt. And sometimes they'd say things like, well, the police deserve what they get. This is payback, whatever. And this one lady I know from another county, not a county I serve, know her from a different way. She had just had a baby. Her husband's pulling all-nighters, multiple days of service during this time. And she's seeing her friends say this. And she says on social media, my husband, your friend, is a police officer too. And I saw on Facebook, on the social media, people respond, well, we don't mean him. But the problem is they're not hearing it that way. And you're not maybe talking that way in social media, and it can cause some trauma, unintentionally or not. At the same time, I'd like to suggest that all of us have to understand that some people have some really valid reasons to be concerned with, maybe even afraid of police based on history. Some reforms have moved faster because of protests that kind of got the attention of people, and we started talking about things in a different way. And although it's not our topic tonight, and there's plenty of resources out there if you want to investigate it, it's okay to say that Black Lives Matter, especially when we're encouraged to hear and understand minority voices and experiences often have been historically overlooked. Still, at the same time, there's limits to the power and usage of slogans. It's kind of like Paul found in Corinth. Sometimes we can wield slogans almost like a weapon, and the slogan can mean things to different people, can mean different things to different people. For example, if someone's saying Black Lives Matter, it could mean that they want to abolish all the police, or they may be in favor of reforms of policing, or they may be anarchist, or they may even want to spark revolution. This is all kind of like when we're talking about racism, we have to say, well, what do you mean when you say racism? What do you understand? You also need to understand, I've talked about this with some other folks when a lot of the protests were going on, that in a protest, you're in this little section of it, and you don't know what's going on even a block or two away. You can be with groups that are very strange, like in Richmond, at one of the protests, you had Proud Boys who lead right. You had Antifa, which are anarchists. You have groups that that were Marxists, that were leaning left. And you could have church groups all mixed in there too. And they all have different goals and all different understandings of why they're there and purposes. All right, so to start, we should recognize, and I know it gets, some people kind of have a hard time understanding this, so I'm going to try to explain systemic issues, at least as I understand them. Now, I come from a family, my family of origin has multiple layers of issues, including alcoholism that spans generations all the way back. I can see it all the way back to the Irish famine and the experience they had with suffering there. Now, I had to, as I became an adult, unlearn some of that because I was playing a part in the system. So we understand that in family counseling. I had to make choices, right, in response. Someone has to decide what's going on. Well, there's similar systems of relationship in faith communities, in organizations, and in greater society, okay? And that can, in fact, impact our social group's health. When we speak of systems from sociology, particularly with a theological bent, to me, it's really just think of it in terms of societal or communal sin. We live in a fallen world. We're in relationship with one another, and what we do impacts one another, okay? So I think it's okay that we need to confess, and it's appropriate that historically law enforcement has been misused. There are times it's been used as muscle for industry in support of the institution of slavery, for control of minorities and other groups, labor unions, things like that. At the same time, law enforcement is part of that larger culture it serves, and it's a political arm of the executive branch in the United States. And so your votes and your opinion and the way the expectations you place on the political leaders matter too. They're going to respond based on what their directions are for a large part, okay? Hopefully a moral grounding is their key, but at some level, these politics that go above them are going to impact how they behave and how good that agency is. Last off, police, as of now, are required to respond to every single call. And the reality is that neighbors can use the police against their other neighbors. Not just what's called swatting, alleging there's a big event going on and causing an emergency response, but it can be just simple as calling about noise complaint. Or maybe as when I was an officer and I was working in housing areas, and at that time they didn't have air conditioning in some of those housing. It's a summer night, people like to hang out, and neighbors keep calling about those people. They're not really making a lot of noise, but here you come as a police officer and you have to talk to them, and then they feel they're being picked on. And the police officers in that moment is kind of the target of that anxiety and that frustration. Another issue we have to include in this discussion is trauma. In criminal and medical emergency situations, police are often and repeatedly exposed to both trauma and secondary, or what's called vicarious trauma. As caretakers, you can take on some of that emotional trauma as you serve and care for others. To save money or to preserve staffing, jurisdictions might lack training or even not really care enough for their officers. In the culture of policing, the old school thinking was just suck it up, right? A lot of officers are very independent, and it was deemed kind of a weakness to seek help. So this is all part of that system too that we have to deal with. One thing that I hope you'll come to understand is that trauma can be different to different people. It can be based on your history. Maybe you came into police work with trauma. It can be affected by your resiliency factors and coping skills. Trauma can be cumulative. So an officer may never have gone through a shooting, for example, but still end up with post-traumatic stress symptoms. This is a lot like when ELCA pastors are required to go to clinical pastoral education. They're supposed to explore their baggage that they have, that they're bringing into that hospital room from their past. And officers have similar family baggage. Maybe they have been a veteran fighting in the war. That could be a problem, or something that could cause a problem. They have experiences that contribute to sometimes unhealthy or criminal behaviors, or even mental illness. Or if it's more positive, it would help them thrive. Trauma, unfortunately, can seep into their work, but also their home life. All right, police subculture. In society, subcultures always exist. Some are healthier than others. None are perfect, okay? Among police, due to the strong sense of shared identity and experience, the subculture tends to be exceedingly strong, exceedingly strong. It can prove a blessing, when an officer's hurt or there's a death. You could have people pay on their own dime to come from California to a New York funeral. I've seen that at my old agency. Thousands of officers can come. At the same time, criticism or threats or failures of police in other jurisdictions can hit them very, very hard emotionally. There's an extreme personalization of this, even though they may not have been involved with these issues. And so, for example, when some of the riots were going on in the area in the US and everything, one of the things I did as a pastor in our church is call the law enforcement officers, including the retired ones, and say, hey, lots going on, how are you doing? You know, because they personalize it. And that personalization actually can be a risk factor for post-traumatic stress symptoms later. So it's very important. It's important to understand that also with this subgroup, if, say, for example, there's low pay, if there's high violence, if there's a feeling that they're in it on their own and they've turned inward because they feel isolated from those they serve, this is also where you'll often see corruption. So it's a huge issue. It can be a strength or weakness. In this context, the ELCA's social statement on criminal justice suggests that Christians are called to confess that we, as individuals and in our common life together, often have fallen short in responding to criminal justice, both in response to crime's harm and to problems in the justice system. At the same time, workers within the criminal justice system cry out. Many work in challenging circumstances where violence and emotional trauma are common, and most experience intense stress, yet are expected to respond to tension or violence calmly. Their professional challenges are rarely recognized or respected. And I argue their exposure to evil and trauma tends to be undervalued and not really understood as well. All right, so one of my inspirations, I graduated from the Virginia Military Institute. One of my inspirations is a graduate that's actually on the Episcopal calendar of saints. His name's Jonathan Daniels. He became an Episcopal seminarian. He was working with the civil rights movement down in Alabama after being released from jail with some other protesters. He came upon a reserve deputy who also was a member of the KKK, and he was going to shoot this African-American teenager who was with him, and he jumped in front of her and saved her life, but in doing so, he died. And when he had his kind of a conversion experience about his need to participate in these protests, I think he understood at some level the system aspect, the sinful aspect of what's going on here. He said, I think it was when I got tear gassed leading a march in Camden that I began to change. I saw that men who came at me were themselves not free. I began to discover a new freedom in the cross, freedom to love the enemy, and in that freedom to will and to try to set him free. And so whether a criminal offender or a police offender, whether it's an addict or just a greedy businessman, Jesus, through the Beatitudes and his other related teachings, stretches out the Torah for us toward greater love and generosity as peacemakers. He also, as some rabbis call it, fences things in for us through his teachings and parables to try to prevent us with specificity from falling into the area of error of legalism, particularly here, justice without mercy. In short, whomever we have grievances against, even for murderers, we're asked by Jesus to love them, to help set them free, as we also seek to love and protect those entrusted to our care. It's a little bit of a law and gospel kind of situation. Now, this doesn't mean there's never any consequences. I'm not talking about that at all. Consequences can teach. They can deter the arrestee or others that see the consequences from offending. Tough love for officers, though, might include suspension, firing, or arrest, yet in some cases, treatment might be a better response at times, just as we might do with delinquents or other criminal offenders. Proactive care, though, I think, positive relationships, I believe, will minimize the risk of a potential offender. Unfortunately, members of society often look at officers in a profoundly dualistic way. They're all good, they're all bad, they're heroes, they're zeros. In reality, they're human, right? And they each have their own characteristics and strengths and weaknesses. And even every agency can have their own strengths, weaknesses, and personality. Education, training, counseling, relationships outside the department, and other positive reinforcements can help them make better choices. It can hold them accountable. It can help them to perform better. Like you or me, as Christians at our best, remember, they're simultaneously sinner and saint, as Luther taught us. When they believe in Christ, they're still not perfect. Okay, and just briefly here, to save some time, I just want to point out that within the criminal justice system, there's a wide variety of communities, agencies, and law enforcement groups that might call themselves, at least on the jackets you see worn, police. But the basic breakdown is federal, state, and local. But among all this myriad group, this really disparate group, they all have their own challenges, strengths, flaws, purpose. And for example, a college and university police officer may not have the skill set and training exactly as an officer up in the city of Alexandria. And so when they go to a call that they're not familiar with, they're still wearing police. Yes, they've been trained. Yes, they've been authorized, but they may not have the skill set, knowledge, wisdom to deal with it effectively. Every unit's going to be different. My belief, if not bias, is that all cops are not bastards. You saw a lot of tagging, ACAB, that stands for all cops are bastards. I think we need to take them individually, and we have to look, at everyone, just as we do, hopefully, with people we're relating to in our family and elsewhere, that there's two sides to every coin. People in situations are not fully all good, all bad. People don't always do anything, okay? So take them as individuals. Most officers, as we've been saying, are regular people. They're doing their best, but they need our help and support to live into this vocation, what is really a sacred calling to protect and to serve. And so oversight, training, people that are familiar with these issues might be able to help them do better. We're talking about professionalization, accountability, and care. And so my goal today is basically to use law enforcement as our lens. In this extreme case, we'll see some trends, some things that we can apply into our life. And we're going to look at the inherent tension which comes with trying to live as a peacemaker in a fallen world. All right, so as we dig in further, according to a lot of research and my personal experience, what you think about policing, what an officer does and who they are is probably wrong. People tend not to understand the job as it's not within their direct experience. When we do know about policing, it's through a filter: media, social media, books, nonprofit reports, speakers, things like that. And sometimes those people that have created those things don't have direct experience either. We might know a police officer, but I would wager that the chances are they haven't fully confided in you about their experience. A lot of times they're trying to protect you from what they've gone through. They might be trying to protect their own emotions, compartmentalize it because it's difficult to talk about, or they may fear judgment. Those are three areas that I think are pretty common. In addition, when you look at studies, even the best studies, there should be replication. A lot of news articles will say, well, a new study says this. Studies have limits. In sociology, you look for what's called systemic reviews, looking and analyzing where there's contrasts and things that come together. And no study's perfect, okay? Now, I'm going to allude to some studies, but keep that in mind. Research should be viewed as an ongoing conversation. It's always incomplete. All right, so with that disclaimer shared, what's on the slide before you now is a recent Pew study echoing other findings that clearly suggest that there's a dramatic rift between what the public thinks they know and what law enforcement thinks the public understands about policing. If you look at the chart and you add it up, 83% of the public believe they understand police work's risks and challenges somewhat or very well, while only 14% of law enforcement surveyed think that's the case. This is a staggering divide. It should be a huge red flag for us that there's a problem. Now, I would suggest that this tends to echo what people might understand about the experience of hospital workers during the pandemic or teachers during the pandemic. We may love them. We may even hear a lot of their stories, but we can't fully understand what's going on with them because we're not in that situation. We don't have all their training and experience. All right, so here's another disturbing yet important example from the same study. Perhaps influenced by popular television police dramas that routinely feature vividly choreographed shootouts, more than 8 in 10 Americans, 83%, believe that typical police officers fire their service weapon while on duty at least once in their career. And about 3 in 10, 31%, believe police discharge their weapon at least a few times a year. In fact, only about a quarter of all officers, 27%, say they have fired their service weapon. This impacts how people look at the police and perceive them as violent, more violent than they probably are, and it can add to an adversarial approach when we're relating between public and police. Now, for me in the 80s and 90s, this was at, when I was an officer, that was what was called the crack wars. You may remember it. It was following Prohibition, which was its own very violent period on its own. Following Prohibition, 1994 was the peak of violence. That's when I was a cop, okay? And I went through 6 years of policing, never fired my weapon other than for training. I always found other ways to make the arrest and stay safe. That's the norm for the vast majority of officers. Perhaps surprisingly, the greatest self-reported stress for an officer isn't criminals or violence. It's administrative expectations and processes that might result in their losing their income, jobs, or freedom. And so that's one of the greatest stresses that they face. All right, it's fair to ask where policing comes from. To save time, I'm not going to go into everything I was going to talk about, but there's multiple streams that have fed into what has become the United States modern policing. It is true, absolutely 100%, that the slave patrols and bounty hunters, particularly in the southern U.S., was an influence upon policing. At the same time, there's other things unrelated to that. The first police department in Boston, for example, set up in 1854. It was feeding and looking at what happened in London with the Bobbies in 1829. And that was a direct response to violence in their system. And they're related to other things, constabulary systems, sheriffs, things like that. We still have sheriffs in Virginia, they're elected. Going back in time, there was a time when soldiers tended to act like the police. There were watch systems, watchmen at night, but you can look at scholarly articles and they'll talk about the history of policing and the interconnectedness going all the way back to the Code of Hammurabi and Babylon. And if you're not familiar with that timing, we're talking about 1780 BC, and a lot of people think Moses lived in the 16th or 13th century. There's been elements of policing and criminal justice dating that far back. Yet we can't ignore the indigenous Aboriginal type cultures either. Every culture hungers for safety. Every culture wants to keep their family safe. And so even with the Lakota culture, which I worked with in South Dakota, if you look at their history, they had groups called warrior societies. And yes, they were soldiers, but they also performed law enforcement tasks. If someone went out and hunted buffalo in a way, maybe snuck out to get an early hunt, and they scared away the buffalo, that puts the entire tribe at risk. And so the Akicha Society, based on judgment of the elders, might tear down their teepee. They might banish them. That could happen for murders too. At the same time, the Lakota tribes and others also offered options for what we might call restorative justice, right? In modern terms, restorative justice. For example, some victims might opt to adopt a murderer of their kin, which I think is remarkable. Now, there's still historic issues. You can look back at any of these periods of time, and there's cruelty, and there's rigidity, justice without mercy, there's abuse, there's harm, because they're human. And we're still struggling with that same stuff today. The human agency is our weakness and our problem. We're sinners. Keep in mind that with all these things that have happened in the past, law enforcement is still developing. It continues to develop and change through sociology and criminology, through technological improvements, through political discussions, and yes, even our culture and their expectations and desire for law enforcement can change things, as well as court cases. All right, another important issue of impacting context is violence itself. Myths tend to dominate. Even within the last couple of weeks, I was hearing politicians and other people say, this is the most violent time in history. This is absolutely not the most violent time in history in the United States, no matter what report you're looking at. The high point, again, following prohibition of the last century was 1994, okay? A recent study by the Council on Criminal Justice finds that violent crime actually declined a little bit over the last year, right? Homicide counts were supposedly 4% lower last year in 2021. And I suppose that should be celebrated. But when you look at other studies, you also see that homicides jumped 30% in 2020. 30% in 2020. And along with that, with the protests and with violence and the social fabric being weaker, other crime happened, and that included attacks on police officers. And so you should anticipate there might be more police force as well. Now, looking at reports of violence, particularly in the news, be careful, because some reports, even government reports, will annotate and try to record police violence that could even be a threat of the use of a weapon. So I could be standing in front of someone and say, hey, you better comply or I'm going to use my taser. Well, some people count that as a use of force report, as a kind of violence. At the same time, we have problems, just as the ELCA has problems with churches reporting status of membership. Police departments don't always comply and make these reports. So there's some legitimate concerns about what are we really dealing with here. Now, if you are younger and your frame of reference might be post-1994, where there was a continuing decline, well, then yes, it might seem like the most violent time in history because violence has increased for you, your experience. Especially in a cycle of news saturation, social media everywhere. Just as a police officer can become hyper alert to threat, we can become hyper alert to threat. And that can be contributed to through the random nature of the violence, the innocence of the victims, and or maybe are relating ourselves to those victims or someone we care about to those victims, the proximity of the events to us, where did this happen? The pervasiveness of the coverage, all of these things can magnify and impact our assessments. Another subset of the data for officers, shootings, and other felonious killing of police indeed tends to be up over these past few years. Note that U-curve from 1990 to 2020. That's significant. Again, with social discord and tensions that come up, social structures become stretched out, less tight, and violence can bubble up, okay? And so you can see more attacks, more ambushes, more felonious killings of law enforcement, generally up, but it's still well below the numbers of when I was an officer. And it's a lot different than what I experienced, okay? At the same time, it remains true that minorities tend to be the most common recipients of police violence, whether it's justified force, right, legal force, or illegal violence. They tend to be the main receptor of this. There's a lot of things that feed into it. We can't get into that right now, including racism would be a part of that puzzle we need to look at. But looking at the Washington Post's tracking, which is one of the better tracking systems that in my opinion, they look at 2015 to let's say like 2019, for example, on this slide, there's been a reduction of police killings to about 1,000 deaths per year. This past year, there was a bit of a rise, so that made headlines. Oh, nothing's really changed since the protests started. There's more police killing people, but that's 4 or 5 years, right? But if you look back further, say to the 1970s, just like a city like New York City, use of deadly force in New York City since 1970s has decreased by 70%. 70%. That's significant by any standard. So again, a lot depends on what crimes you're looking at, what period you're covering, and your personal relationship to that information. Now, when deaths are at 1,000 per year, and you hear of illegal murders and manslaughters under the guise of authority, then one can still say for sure that's too many, of course. And especially when it's a neighbor or a family member or someone that looks like you, One can be too many, especially when there's this historic lack of trust and or understanding. So that's our current and ongoing problem, okay? As much as it might have declined, it's not enough. If one person dies, it's too many, right? But can we get to none? In a fallen world, personally, I'm not sure that we can, but that should be our goal, right? It can't just be feelings we're talking about here. It can't just be statistics we're talking about here. We have to take into effect both. I've heard folks say that some people, for example, will say, well, there's more chance of you being killed by a police officer than being struck by lightning. But I can tell you that if I hear a thunderstorm, what am I going to do? I'm going to go inside. I'm not standing out in the field. Folks are legitimately have cause to be concerned. In fact, just ironically, just yesterday, I was at a restaurant talking to somebody. I had not met him before, and he was struck by lightning. All right, so as for protests and violence, right? There's good that comes from protests, there's bad that comes from protests. They're nationally, primarily, the protests were peaceful. I need to make that clear. Nationally, they were peaceful. But when you look at the subset of the data for major metropolitan areas, guess what? They were violent. And so where does the news tend to focus on? The violent areas. So still a concern, not trying to minimize it, but it really depends on where you were, how you experienced this event. Yet amidst the violence, amidst the struggle, we saw some very brave and loving people, protesters, that stood up to those who wanted to do violence to officers. There were times when people crossed lines to try to start or restart relationship. That's brave, that's loving. At the same time, in crowds or mobs, when there's violence that is starting in any public gathering, there can be groupthink. Remember that people can sometimes act more boldly or recklessly than they normally would. People, just like we can be more aggressive on Facebook or something if we're anonymous, right? We're in this crowd, and people at some level know they might get hurt by confronting a police officer, but they also know they have this large crowd around them that might protect them, that is on their side, that might look at them as a hero. And so a lot of times those crowds outnumber police, and there are cameras there, and that's another safety factor. So they might stretch their behaviors a little bit. Under law, there's very little officers can do in response to insult, okay? I mean, I've had all kinds of things said to me when I was a police officer. I've been made fun of just being a chaplain on scene. There's a sense of safety sometimes that people feel, even though the officer's wearing a gun, it doesn't matter, okay? From my experience, quite often as a police officer and observing police officers on ordinary interactions on patrol, you can find people that will challenge police to a fight, that will threaten their lives and their families, that will spit on them or throw things at them, particularly for minority officers, they will be very verbally abusive with racial epithets. They'll do all these things knowing that there's a really good chance the officer can't do anything. And within this time where anger is so trending, and it tends to be directed at all officers in a blanket way, I also know of officers personally who have had their lives threatened over these last few years, or the lives of their families. And in one case, one good friend of mine from the past, working in another state, had multiple threats of rape against his daughters. It was scary. People knew where he lived and were making these threats on a daily basis, okay? They can go to restaurants. I know of from the news, not personally, but it was something we had to be concerned of even when I was a cop. You can go to a restaurant, someone can put something in your food. There was an officer that ate glass. There were all kinds of things. Poison had been added over these last several years of food. Officers have been refused service at restaurants. They've received messages of hates on their receipts or their bags. Yes, there's also been people supporting them too. I don't want to forget that. And I'm aware of others, as in the picture here, that protested with real pigs' heads and the throwing of pig's blood on private homes. And there's no way to not consider that a threat. I mean, it's like The Godfather when they put the horse's head in the bed. It wasn't a love letter, right? This has psychological impacts on officers and their families. Even if it doesn't happen to them, they hear about it and it can increase anxiety, stress, and other issues. You know, we've been in this a traumatic period. Whatever you think about the pandemic, whatever you think about these things going on, there's been a lot of stress for all of us. We've seen it impact our kids, right? We've been divided politically more than we have been in recent times. There's extremist groups that exist on the left, and right now, nationally, on the right, they're growing faster. And they both tend to hate police. And police can seem hated by everyone. And they're often placed in the middle of these warring factions. One time against a more conservative group, the next time they're against a more liberal group, or they're between them. All right, so from an old PBS show I saw, I'm sorry I don't remember the poet, but there was a beat poet from the 60s. He said, if you call police pigs enough, they'll tend to act like them. Echoing the Jewish scriptures, Jesus and later Martin Luther's own interpretation of loving others as ourselves includes aspects of loving the enemy, seeing their humanity. We can be murderers as we kill people's spirit and contribute to the loss of hope. Perhaps ultimately suicides and death of relationships can happen. And so, for example, Luther argues convincingly on the 10 Commandments that bearing false witness isn't just something you do in court. For us, we understand it. It could be with the words we share. It could be the posts we make, right, that defames and wounds others. For all of us, however we communicate as sinners ourselves, Luther encouraged us to interpret other people's actions in the most generous way possible. With this situation going on, I have been busier. Now, I've been a chaplain since 2008. I've been busy these last 3 years with post-traumatic stress symptoms, including referrals from other states. Because of trauma, yes, but also this disconnect, this tension that comes from trying to serve honorably, doing your best, and then being told how evil you are, how you're wasting your life, how you're Satan's spawn. There's a moral tension that comes up. There's a moral injury that happens. Okay, with all this, police work is sometimes said to be death work. All right, now following Jesus, we're serving life. We're promoting his peace. But we need to understand it comes with cost. There's a dying to ourselves, and there's dealing with death. Now, of course, officers miss a lot of holidays. They do all these things that can infect their family and all that. But why is policing called death work? Well, officers often plan for death. They train for death. They create and read statistics dealing with death. They handle death scenes that are often grotesque. They face death, potential death for themselves or in reality for their friends. I remember closing my door, going to work, and thinking just for a moment that this could be the last time I saw my doorway. Death is part of a police officer's life. Death, suffering, and grief seem ever present at some level. Yet what might surprise some people is that accidents and non-gun related violence, unarmed or armed, tend to kill more officers yearly than gun violence. And then within the recent pandemic, you may not have noticed or heard, because sometimes the media hasn't reported on it as they have with other vocations. In 2020, over 400 officers, the leading cause of death was COVID. And that makes sense because they're out and about serving amidst this pandemic. Now, during my own 6 years in law enforcement, at that peak time, remember, the murder of an officer that I knew occurred as I came on. And then the suicide of his partner happened as I was preparing to leave. That partner had been injured at the same incident. These deaths framed my experience with policing. I had another friend, dear friend, who died after a foot chase. He had a congenital heart condition. No one knew about it. And one of my supervisors eventually succumbed to his injuries from being shot during a robbery interaction. He died from after many painful years of dealing with lead poisoning. His death is considered a line of duty death. I had another friend who was nearly killed by a drunk driver. In 6 years, a lot of folks say unarmed people are not dangerous, but in 6 years, I had 4 unarmed people try to seriously take my weapon. And I'm not talking just a little touch of my weapon. I mean, I had to fight for my weapon, okay? a life and death kind of thing. One of these suspects was a person who had just been released from prison for murdering someone, and he was trying to take my weapon. And I'm pretty confident if he had gotten it, someone would have died that night out of his anger. All right. He may not have intended to do it, but that would probably be the result. Yet with all this going on, for my last partner and I on a special assignment in an inner city neighborhood where there was primarily minority, low-income families, high crime, we were on this community policing detail, and we were relating to the public. We were healthier than some. Maybe we were rooted in faith more than others. Perhaps we had a kinder personality, a little maturity, but we ended up being well respected and supported in the neighborhood we served. We actually had people help us make arrests. We had people protect us. It was wonderful. There was one time when another officer was making an arrest. He was a little aggressive, and I wasn't there. I don't know exactly what started this whole thing, but when we showed up, they went from throwing bottles and rocks to talking to us. That shows an extreme level of trust. And so when community policing is done right, that's what you can get. Yet at the same time, in that same neighborhood, from that same work, we had a gang from Hybla Valley in Fairfax County that allegedly had a contract out on my partner and I. And so all of a sudden, I have to carry my gun and I have to look around more than usual because someone could be trying to kill me. Yet at some churches, because I'm carrying a weapon, as an officer even, I wouldn't have been allowed to go to. And so that's something you might want to think of as a caveat to your weapons policy at your church. Maybe make an exception for police, because you do not know, as I had in another congregation, somebody had a death threat against them. You don't know what they're facing, all right? You deal with death and near death over and over and over again. My first dead body was a person that no one missed for a whole week in the summertime. You don't forget the sights, the smells, everything related to that. That's actually called, that first one's actually called a death imprint. And you tend to remember that more than others. In my 6 years, I had bodies that were burned to death, decapitated, stabbed, shot, and more, okay? Choked to death too, hung. I've seen more deaths since serving as a chaplain, including homicides. You cannot unsee these scenes. You have to take care of yourself. You have to be on point. It's going to be a challenge to your mental, emotional, and spiritual health. This reflects that problem of evil, the theodicy issues that we're talking about. Why does a loving God allow such suffering? And so after so many different experiences with a disproportionate amount of evil, officers can begin to take this work, this bent vision of life, home with them. They can react too harshly and quickly to threats. Cynicism can grow. Some officers think of cynicism as a protective shield, but in reality, cynicism causes all kinds of health problems, and you break off in relationships. Cynicism is not the same thing as a healthy skepticism. And even after retirement, you will find officers still behaving as if an officer. They're going to face restaurant doors looking for threats. They're going to look for exits when you're entering a room, things like that. Trauma is cumulative, and post-traumatic stress symptoms can come after retirement. It can be years later. Maybe they're facing their own deaths, like a World War II veteran I worked with, facing their own death. A lot of old things came up. That can happen in your congregation. Some care practitioners are starting to suggest, to argue forcefully, that nearly 100% of officers will face some form of post-traumatic stress symptoms in their lifetime. Not necessarily full-on continuing disorder, but something they have to deal with, some symptoms that are interfering with their lives at some point. All right, and then some people say, well, there are more dangerous jobs. And you're absolutely right. Based on statistics, there's more dangerous jobs. On this particular list that I took from, police are listed as number 22. But the difference is that we need to remember is that trees won't come to your house to try to kill you. Accidents can happen to police officers too at any time. You don't have to worry about, garbage cans falling on you or some other kind of thing. But with policing, it can be 24 hours of threat, especially when people know you're home. I know of officers that have had people follow their cars, come to their home, and do things. I know of cases like that. All right, and then militarization of police. We talked about how in history, soldiers sometimes had policing aspects. There's an element of that because people don't like to be told what to do. They don't like to be told no, and some can be violent themselves. And then when you had the crack epidemic of the 1980s and 90s, and then later terrorism, there was more militarization, and not all of it was thoughtful. Yet it's important to remember that the equipment that you have, including the vest that you have, is not 100% protection. Officers, like one officer at my former agency, wearing a vest, wearing a helmet, got shot in the head anyway. You can get shot in the neck. You can bleed out from a cut to your artery on your leg or your arms. Military equipment has its limits. Military equipment such as tracked vehicles was clearly, according to police evaluation, misused in Ferguson, Missouri. And yet in other places it's been used, such as with the Hurricane Harvey, to save people's lives. Military equipment can be threatening and problematic in a community, but there's times like the Pulse nightclub where it saved an officer's life. That helmet there shows where a bullet entered into the helmet, but it did not penetrate to the officer. And so the officer survived. Militarization needs to be discussed and all the related issues to it. But one thing we have to remember, any use of force can be, even when it's called non-lethal, can end up being lethal force. Tasering someone can cause a heart attack. Pepper spray can cause an asthma attack. A simple push or putting someone down to the ground can cause a head injury that could kill someone. So what we should be aiming for is to not have to use force, but when we do, how do we do it in the safest way possible? It's important to remember, and sometimes media lumps it all together, that police violence is what you're often hearing talked about today. Police violence, there's two kinds. One is what is legal and authorized, and one that's illegal, okay, and abusive. And so there's a lot going on there. All right, just personal factors that can influence use of force decisions. It's more correlative than causational. Officers with higher education tend to use force less. Officers who are women tend to use force less. People who have been in fear or near-death situations, they sometimes might be more prone to using force, or they might be less prone to using force. More prone if they have more anxiety about being harmed, less prone if maybe they have some moral injury about the use of force they used, and so they hesitate to use it and then therefore can get injured. Non-white officers tend to use force less, and I would argue that mentally and emotionally healthy officers tend to use force less, okay? And so these are some of the things we can think about as we're talking about policing, but a lot of times that's not considered in hiring practices and deploying of police. Ultimately, regardless of the chaos around us, we are blessed with peace, right, by Jesus, to be peace in the world, to be Jesus of the world. And so as a Christian police officer or a Christian in any other vocation, it's a sacred calling in Lutheranism as we understand it. We have some things to think about here, all right, or at least to advocate and talk about. All right, so now we're going to transition. Jesus is Prince of Peace. You know, he's our model. He's in the Beatitudes, and his living example reflects Scripture, particularly Deuteronomy and Matthew's Gospel. And within all of that, loving God with all that we are and ourselves can be found. But also within all of that is these direct applications to laws, using justice and mercy over and over and again. And so as individuals and as a group, we can take actions to promote harmony. We can seek to reconcile people with God and one another. We can build bridges between unbelievers and God and different groups in God, ministry of reconciliation. We can seek good laws and just enforcement with mercy. We can try to be meek like Moses and Jesus. That word meek used in the Beatitudes is the same word used to describe Moses and Jesus. It's not about being a pushover. It's not about weakness. It's really this strong servant leadership that's humble. We, as hopefully you've been hearing, you know, the kingdom of God is here through Christ, but it's not yet in its fullness. We are children of God, preparing, hoping, living for that day when it comes. All right, so how are we called to peace concretely? Traditionally, Lutherans are not pacifists, right? Pacifists are persons who strictly believe that war and violence are always unjustifiable. There are some Lutheran pacifists, but not many. arguing that evil in the world, there are some people that are not pacifists that argue that evil in the world needs to be contained with a minimum use of force, but only as necessary. And you might recall that there was a famous Lutheran pacifist, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who joined a plot to assassinate Hitler because he felt not doing anything was a greater evil. And in his ethical wrestling, you can find in his writings, he made sense of it in this way. He concluded that the cause of the violence, the sin that was causing him to respond, rested primarily on the ones making his actions necessary, which would be the Nazis. They were the ones where the millstone would be hung around and needed to be thrown into the ocean. So we come to see again that context might matter. Our personal call, our individual call and witness in the world might even change over time based on what situations we're facing. Similarly, during the Peasant War, Martin Luther wrote, there's a big question, can soldiers be saved? And so he's, we have this maxim of turning the other cheek and thou shalt not murder, all these things. And so he wrote this article. He felt that even with the excesses of the Peasant War, that there's sometimes government was needed to use force. And he believed that enforcement powers belong to the state as one arm of God's care for the world, that two kingdom theology he has, church being the other. And within this world, he sometimes thought that individuals might be called, like doctors, to remove a tumor if one exists. Now that's harsh symbolism, it's medieval thought, it's within a violent time, it's kind of utilitarian, but his thinking was that some people might need to face the threat of violence in order to save countless more innocent lives and preserve peace. And with all that's been shared tonight, we need to remember that the use of force always has costs. It results in trauma in those who use it. It's going to have trauma for those impacted by it. It's going to have an effect on those who witness it. There's often resulting moral and ethical tensions that can cause lifelong wounds for those that use violence. And so just a quick few thoughts on the attitude of peace. Begin the work of peace within yourself so that once you are at peace yourself, you can bring peace to others. That's from Ambrose. It kind of parallels like family counseling. Start in yourself and others might or might not change, but you'll become freer to live and love. I found this true in my police work. It clarified my purpose. It cleared my mind. I made better choices. If you don't like somebody, remember that you're looking at Christ in the face. Mother Gravilia, an Orthodox nun. We have to work on forgiveness, even if the person doesn't deserve it. This might free us a little bit. It's a lifelong effort. It might be continual. Reconciliation might never happen, but forgiveness is a healing medicine, and it can help us build empathy and compassion within us, even if it doesn't change others. And then finally, from my influence, Brother Roger, he said that even at the worst of times, he talked about this. He wrote, I leave you peace, I give you peace, quoting Jesus. What is this peace that God gives? It is first of all an inner peace, a peace of the heart. This peace enables us to look at the world with hope, even though it's often torn apart by violence and conflicts. The peace from God also supports us so that we can contribute quite humbly to building peace in those places where it's jeopardized. And so these traditional understands of Christianity of confession, repentance, and forgiveness, and even lament, that can be part of this process of healing. Use of force is always staying with some kind of sin, right? We're fallen. We're never going to do things perfect. In the Orthodox tradition, it's considered a good thing for soldiers to repent, to confess what they've done and to repent from it and be forgiven. Truth-telling, that can be helpful. Public confession, that can be helpful. Accepting where wrongs were done. It was proved useful in South Africa and North Island. It could work in the US. Reaching out to those who might be in opposition, who have harmed us, doing good, even small kindnesses towards them, might make a big difference. So those ice cream giveaways and picnics that are diminished by some might actually help build relationships over time. And we see departments trying to participate in all these things. All right, so pick up your cross and follow me. In life, following Jesus, trying to do good can result in rejection, trauma, secondary trauma, sacrifice of your life, risk to your freedom or comforts or family relationships, other relationships. There's a cost to this, right? We saw this with policing. There's implications as a peacemaker in a world that is often selfish and too often violent, that people can even die trying to defend this value, try to live this out. You can be condemned. The blessing is not in that things are easy. The blessing is that God, who is peace, is also with us. We're grafted into God's saving plan. We're grafted into his love. So never give up, receive the blessing God offers you. Use all those tools for resiliency and community and anything that you can grasp a hold onto, this grace being offered to you. You're going to be more successful and experience joy and peace, even amidst your struggles. There were times I could find myself going to a shooting, praying in my heart, and finding peace, even as I was going into a dangerous situation. The Jewish expectation within the Beatitudes is that the righteous will need to wait for vindication. That frames the Beatitudes. Everything's not perfect now, and we're in a period of waiting. All right, we're going to be leaving the breakout in a minute, but as peacemakers, we're called to protect and serve. Small things done in great love can help change things. Next, who is called? Remember that Jesus called called soldiers, centurions, even as they were about, some of them would be going to be torturing and killing him eventually. Don't be surprised who's called to follow this call of peace. Always keep openness. All right, so we want to talk about shalom, just that's what we're working for, peace. And peace is represented in that completeness, that wholeness that God offers. It's peacemaking is no small thing. Let me just, if I have time before they eject us, that one person wrote, the webbing together of God, humans, and all creation and justice, fulfillment and delight is what the Hebrew prophets call shalom. We call it peace, but it means far more than mere peace of mind or ceasefire between enemies. In the Bible, shalom means universal flourishing, wholeness, and delight, a rich state of affairs in which natural needs are satisfied and natural gifts fruitfully employed, a state of affairs that inspires joyful wonder as Creator and Savior opens doors and welcomes the creatures in whom he delights. Shalom, in other words, is the way things ought to be. So shalom, y'all, and I think we're going to have to go. If you have questions, write me later.